Hello, in this video we are going to learn how we can take a list of data and analyze it with the use of Excel pivot tables. As the sample data set, I have selected passenger data from the San Francisco International Airport from a period of July 2005 through the end of September 2014. Our data set includes for every month in that period the airline, how many passengers in the passenger count deplaned, enplaned, or were transit passengers, and it has some additional information about the airline and the terminal in which the passengers were counted. So this is a fairly large data set. There are 12,823 data rows. So analyzing this data with the use of a simple data table like what I have here is not going to be so easy. So instead we will look at the power of pivot tables. The first thing we'll need to do is create a pivot table. Now there are two ways to create a pivot table. From any Excel workbook or a range on a workbook, we can create a pivot table using the Insert tab on the ribbon and clicking Pivot Table. And Excel is going to make a guess as to which range we would like to use for our pivot table, and it has correctly selected the passenger data table. We can also select then whether we want this pivot table report to be placed in a new worksheet or in an existing worksheet. It's best to have your pivot tables on a worksheet on their own, on a worksheet by themselves, instead of mixing in your pivot table with the raw data that you have. Now if you look at this Excel workbook, it only has one sheet right now, so if I want this pivot table to be on a worksheet on its own, I will have to select the new worksheet option. For simplicity's sake, we are not going to discuss data models. So I'm going to click OK. And like I said, this is one way of creating a pivot table. If you already have a data table, which is the case here, we can also create a pivot table from this data table using the Summarize with Pivot Table command that is on the Data Table Design Tools tab. And it brings up the same dialog box with the same options. So my sheet 1 now is where my pivot table is. You can see that the fields that are available to be added to the report are indeed the names of the columns that were in my data table. Now we'll start by looking at the different areas that are defined below the list of fields. In the values area, which is your bottom right area, that's where you're going to put your numeric values that will be aggregated. Now aggregating can mean summing or averaging or calculating standard deviations, different types of calculations like that, but that should be numeric data. Now the only type of numeric data that we have here is the passenger count. So I will drag and drop the passenger count field to the values area. And that tells me right there that Excel has automatically determined that it will make a sum of those passenger count values, and that the sum of those passenger count values is 365,780,702. Okay, so that already is interesting information. It means that over the entire period of my raw data, namely from July 2005 all the way through September 2014, the San Francisco International Airport has handled 365,780,702 passengers. Now the formatting of this number may leave a little to be desired, and it may also be that we might not be interested in a sum of passengers, but we may be interested in an average or in some other aggregate function. So let's take a look at how we can modify this. The drop-down arrow next to our sum of passenger count gives us access to the value field settings dialog box, and this value field settings dialog box allows us to, first of all, change the name. If we do not want it to be called sum of passenger count, but maybe we just want to call it passenger count, then we can do that. We can then select the aggregate function. You can see that your standard aggregate functions in Excel are available right here. Now for our use, sum is fine. Now if we want to format those numbers to make them a little bit easier to read, then the correct way to do that is to use the number format dialog box here. And not to go to the traditional number format options that are found in the ribbon. The correct way to do it is using that button right there. So we will format this as a number. There are no decimal places needed, but we would like to see some separators between every 1,000 values. Click OK, click OK again. And so now I have a different, more appropriate field label, and the number is easier to read as well. Now the power of pivot tables, of course, comes in the ability to slice and dice my data. One of the things that I might want to do is look at the passengers that pass through the airport each month. So I can take the activity period, which is essentially a date field here. I can take that and drag it to the rows. And now I can see that in July 2005 there were 3,225,769 passengers all down the list, and see that at the bottom automatically a grand total was added, which of course is the same value we had before. And I can very quickly add or remove additional columns like that, or rows. So I can say, well, I want like to see this broken down by month, but also broken down by the airlines region. Was this an international or domestic flight? Well, there we go. Now I've dragged and dropped the geo summary field to the columns area, which gives me for each value in the geo summary a new column. So domestic and international, my row labels have of course remained unchanged. Those are my activity periods. So in July 05, my grand total for July 05 is still the same, 3,225,769, but I can now see how that number was made up of domestic and international airlines. And again, scroll all the way down the list, I see grand totals for domestic and international. So PivotTable gives us this enormous amount of flexibility. I can add more than one level of column or more than one level of rows. For example, I could add the geo region below the geo summary. Okay, and this would then give me a further breakdown. So of course domestic is US only, so those numbers don't actually change. But under international, I can now see that airlines originating in Asia had 359,514 passengers. Airlines originating in Australia, Oceania, Canada, Central America, Europe, Mexico, the Middle East, none, and South America, none in those early days. But if we start scrolling down, we see that we start having airlines from those regions in the world during the later years of our data set. And then we still have international total there and the grand total. So we have the ability to make these multiple levels. We could also find that we have too much information visible at the same time. We don't always want to drill down. So if we have multiple levels, we can collapse those columns and quickly expand them again if we so desire. So very flexible and very powerful using simple drag and drop operations on our data. Now, one of the things that you will probably want to look at are these dates, these activity periods that we've put as the row label. It would be very interesting if we could have a count of passengers for every year. Of course, for 2005, we only have data for half a year, but we would like to perhaps group this for every year. And the same then for 2006, 7, and so forth. Well, that is possible directly within the pivot table, and in order to accomplish that, we have to go to the Analyze tab. We have to have any of these row labels selected. So in my case, I've selected January 2006. It doesn't really matter, just any one of them will do. And then we are going to use the group field command, and we can use that for numeric fields or for date fields. And so for date fields such as this one, it actually gives us the ability to break down that date field however we like. We can, if we had time in there, we could go to as much detail as seconds, and we can go all the way up to years. Now for us it doesn't really make a difference to go into quarters. That might be something very useful for financial analysis perhaps, but for these passenger counts we are going to skip quarters, and we're simply going to say that we want Excel to group our dates in months and in years, and simply click OK. And now that's exactly what has happened. Now what's really happened in the background is that Excel has added a new field called years, and we can use that field just like any other field. I can turn it back off and only see the months of the activity periods, or I can put it back and have my same hierarchy available to me. And because that is a hierarchy now, just like I could do with the regions, I can collapse that and get my numbers year by year, and only drill down, for example, in those years that I would like to see some detail. So very powerful functionality that's available here within Excel and within the pivot tables. One final thing that you need to be aware of is that for some of these fields, it could happen that we are going to add an amount of detail that becomes overwhelming. So I'm going to move away the geo summary and the geo region fields, and instead I'm going to take the operating airline and add that as a column. Now there are a lot of different airlines that operate in San Francisco International Airport, and so the data at this point may very well become overwhelming. So we need to find a way to be able to focus on what's really important. For example, we have World Airways operating a total of 785 passengers out of that total of 365 million. And there are many more such small airlines. So that, depending on our need, of course, but those may not be the airlines that we want to see here. So what we can do is we can choose to have those filtered by their value. So we can say that we want only to see airlines that are perhaps, numerically speaking, in the top 10. In other words, the top 10 airlines by total passenger count. We could also choose the top 10% by passenger count. So if we do that, the top 10%, then we're going to see that well, that's only United Airlines that gives us that's in the top 10%. So clearly that's the largest airline by far operating in San Francisco International Airport. So let's try that again with a different filter. So we'll switch it to the top 10 items. So now we'll see the top 10 airlines, and now we see Alaska, American, Delta, Northwest, which later on of course was absorbed by Delta Airlines. That's why you see that break. SkyWest, Southwest, and there of course United Airlines still shows up, and having US Airways, Virgin America. So those are the top 10 operating airlines at San Francisco International Airport, and that gives me, let's see here, that accounts for 297 million of the 365 million passengers. So it makes it a lot more manageable to see that data. Of course, maybe I want to focus on the lowest or the smallest 10 airlines by passenger count, and then certainly do that as well. Maybe those are the airlines that I would like to count, and see what maybe we can do to increase traffic from those airlines. We can certainly look at it that way as well, and get Excel to give us the analysis however we would like it to be done. So I invite you to go into our course shell and download this passenger raw data spreadsheet for yourself, make a pivot table, and experiment with it. There will be one more video that uses pivot tables, and in the next video we will see how to create a pivot chart from this pivot table and some best practices for that. Thank you for watching.